Joining us, former acting assistant attorney general for national security at the DOJ and MS Now legal analyst Mary McCord, MS Now senior legal reporter Lisa Rubin, host of The Beat, and MS Now chief legal reporter Ari Melber, and New York Times White House correspondent and MS Now contributor Peter Baker. All right, Ari, I'm going to start with you. Chuck Schumer called that slip, the "I'm his lawyer" slip, Freudian. What do you think?
Well, as you know, Freud believed that the unconscious mind was ultimately often more powerful and important than our actual conscious words. And the Freudian slip, the joke, was a reveal. So if you want to use that analysis, yeah, it sounded like that because he acts like he's his lawyer. He doesn't act like an independent attorney general. I thought the Republicans mostly tried to sort of paper over and kind of confuse some of these issues today. I thought Mr. Blanche had a poor hand that he played effectively because his style, his demeanor, his sort of, people saw it, his sort of assertively cool mode with both sides of the aisles questioning. Yeah, some might find it smug, others might find it even keeled, depends whether you like him. But that whole mode helped to try to detract from the reality that we are in a rule of law crisis, that he is part of that problem, a corruption crisis, where he hasn't done anything to deal with investigating and holding accountable corruption inside the government. Right now, he could appoint a special counsel. He could uphold law enforcement and anti-corruption parts of the DOJ. He hasn't done that on the job. And to the contrary, he's tried to hand out money to MAGA allied criminals, and then only under court pressure and Republican pressure backed off. And even then, as you saw with Cornyn, he just couldn't say, we're not going to do it, and therefore we're going to dissolve this agreement. And the whole thing is a scam because the lawyers you refer to are Trump's lawyers. So this idea of, oh, well, I wonder what they might do and what he referred to enforcing it. So I thought he got through the hearing, but I don't think he accorded himself with any great integrity.
Mary?
I agree with Ari. I would also say, he was very hyper-technical in his responses, too, so that he could be perceived potentially to people who are not as deep in it as those of us at the table are. He could be perceived to be answering a question, but he was doing so in such a hyper-technical way that it didn't really reveal anything about, his real answer. And I would also say we have more than just sort of him failing to investigate corruption within the department elsewhere. He's part of the corruption, right? I mean, what you were just talking about, Ari, the whole quote-unquote settlement agreement of a collusive lawsuit as found by Judge Williams just in an opinion on Monday was horribly corrupt. I mean, a corruption that led to not just this weaponization fund, this slush fund to pay out money to so-called victims of weaponization, but the complete and absolute civil and criminal immunity, not just for past tax liability, as Todd Blanche indicated, but for anything brought by any federal department or agency. That is what it says. He denied that, but it could be investigations based on facts up until the date of the settlement on May 15th that any department or agency could engage in. So it's total and complete civil and criminal immunity.
What did you make of John Cornyn really going after him on the settlement wording, the language? He put up a poster that had the language up on display, and he walked through it, as we just played a moment ago, with Todd Blanche. What do you make of that?
Well, Cornyn was the only Republican I saw that really did push, I think, Todd Blanche on anything with respect to his performance as a deputy attorney general. And, the fact that Blanche still denied what this settlement addendum does, even while the senator pointed out the language.
The
was
words
pretty
in front of him.
Yeah. Yes, the words are pretty clear. And I don't know if he never read the addendum. He denied later in an exchange with Ted Cruz, even knowing who typed it up when he was asked who wrote. No, I'm sorry, not with Ted Cruz. Who was that with? With somebody. I listened to all of these. Yes, Adam Schiff. That's right. Thank you, Lisa. He denied knowing who, quote unquote, typed it up, but somebody had to come up with its content. And his is the only name on that addendum.
Lisa.
Well, I think there's no question that Todd Blanche is smart. And the reason I say that is to go back to Mary's point about sort of the hyper-technical interpretations of questions. I saw that happen time and time again, and I want to give you and our viewers a few examples. He was asked by Alex Padilla about the possibility that January 6 defendants would still seek compensation through a federal law known as the Federal Tort Claims Act. The way that works is you submit a claim on a pre-existing form, and then if you don't get a settlement from the Department of Justice within a particular period of time, then you can bring it to litigation. And so when he was asked, can you commit that you will not pay out January 6 defendants through the Federal Tort Claims Act, his answer was like, I can't block people from filing claims. Are you talking about the litigation? He never would say that this department would commit that it will not pay out on those claims. There was that whole, I don't know who typed it up, about the tax settlement exchange with Schiff. And then Cory Booker pressed him about the arrest of Ras Baraka outside Delaney Hall. That's the episode that led to the arrest and now the prosecution of LaMonica McIver, the member of Congress from New Jersey. And there is body camera footage on which an agent is basically saying it's time to arrest Mayor Baraka. It's been per order of the Deputy Attorney General. He's referring to Todd Blanche. He asked Todd Blanche, did you in fact order Mayor Baraka's arrest? And he said, well, I didn't order it. I authorized it. So there was a lot of hyper-technical, picayunish language today that shows Todd Blanche knows how to answer a question, but there were lots of unsatisfactory answers about any number of topics, including the Epstein files and how he's handled survivors.
Peter, what were your takeaways?
Yeah, I mean, I think it was fascinating on a couple of levels. One, he did try to distance himself a little bit at times from Trump. He was asked about impeaching judges, something that Trump has talked about, and he, disavowed that. He was asked about whether the president could run for re-election in 2028, something that he's kind of teased out there, maybe as a troll to his adversary, something he thought he might do despite the Constitution. And Blanche made clear, no, he didn't think that was legal. But broadly speaking, he was on board. And obviously, he was trying to appeal to, at this point, to an audience of two, Thom Tillis and John Cornyn. It seems like maybe he did succeed with Thom Tillis, who told him at the end of the hearing that he did a, quote, great job. But John Cornyn obviously will be the one who all eyes are on now from now on at this point. If John Cornyn says no, this is a nomination that it's hard to see how it advances out of the committee because they lost the vote of Lindsey Graham when he passed away last weekend. So John Cornyn, is a fascinating figure to watch. He's not a rebel. He's not a maverick. He's not a John McCain who goes onto the floor and gives a thumbs down in a very dramatic way. It's not his way, but he did lose that primary after Trump endorsed his opponent, Ken Paxton. He has nothing to lose, arguably, at this point. And he does seem genuinely offended by this agreement that gives Trump, audit-free, access to all the money he would have had to pay in back taxes. By the way, my colleagues reported that could be $100 million or more given interest. That's a personal benefit to the president of the United States. So that's what John Cornyn is thinking about. All eyes are going to be on him going forward.
Yeah, and that's why I asked the question the way I did at the end of the lead-in to all of you wonderful people that have joined me today. If Republicans weren't so afraid of Donald Trump, and I mean politically and I mean professionally, but I think do some personally as well, after January 6th, we saw how people were chased down in airports and the threats that they have to their lives. We heard it from the judges yesterday that were on Capitol Hill talking about the threats that they face. If they were not so afraid of Donald Trump, would more of them on that panel, would they have sounded more like John Cornyn with respect to Todd Blanche and everything that he's done so far as Deputy Attorney General, Peter?
I mean, that's a good question, right? No question that the president enforces loyalty in part through fear, fear of primaries, fear of backlash from the voters, fear of, some sort of punishment from the president in some way. Remember, this is a president whose administration, under Todd Blanche, by the way, as Deputy Attorney General, authorized the indictment of 5 Democratic senators who put together a video saying that U.S. troops should not follow illegal orders. He was trying to indict them for saying the law. Now, that didn't get passed by a grand jury, but that didn't mean that the administration didn't try to do it. Don't think people didn't pay attention to that. But I think if these senators had been grilling a Democratic nominee for Attorney General who had done some of the things that Todd Blanche had done, I think you would have heard a very different set of questions.
Yeah, and this is what frustrates me, and I'm sure many people out there, a lot of people out there, You feel like you're taking crazy pills. You have two separate hearings that you're watching with two separate priorities. The Republicans were all about mifepristone. The Democrats were all about corruption and him acting as a personal attorney. And I think if you're watching and you're not so schooled in the particulars of what has been going on, it is hard to figure out what's happening in Washington.
I had a similar reaction. We were maybe an hour in, and I thought, if you're just an average viewer, and no, MS Now viewers are average viewers, but if you're an average viewer, you could tune in and think this was a run-of-the-mill confirmation hearing. There needed to be sort of an overarching statement at the outset, I think, from the Democrats. And I don't want to be overly political here, but to your point, like, it was like, you know,
two
as
different
Nicole
hearings.
Wallace says, Earth 1 and Earth 2, completely two different hearings, two alternate facts and everything else. And you know, I think we really need to, the Democrats, and I would say Republicans should be very concerned about the lack of independence of the Department of Justice and the lack of even any concern that there is a lack of independence.
It's like when you don't draw a line and you refuse to draw it, we get caught in these cycles, and we're going to keep doing a version of this where one side takes one issue and the other side takes the other issue, and they pretend like the others don't exist, or the others are taking their own crazy pills. And we're in this maze, and it's so hard to pull ourselves or find our way through it. Peter Baker, we're going to say goodbye to you. Thank you so much for joining us today. We're going to continue talking about this.
Welcome to The Beat. I'm Ari Melber. We are covering this high-stakes confirmation hearing for one of the most important posts in government, the Attorney General. It is a post that has become an obsession for President Trump as he tries to corrupt the DOJ into a political operation that he wants to persecute and indict critics and jail his opposition.
Do you believe it is the president's right and duty to order the investigation or prosecution of his perceived enemies? Yes or no?
I can't answer that yes or no. Is the Department of Justice that you are running independent from the White House?
The Department of Justice, like every single department in the executive, is part of the executive.
The Attorney General's client is not the president. It's the American people.
How long do you intend to put up with that Kash Patel character?
That's an extraordinarily obnoxious question, Senator.
Who you are is someone willing to sacrifice everything you once believed in for that title.
Are you and President Trump friends?
I'm his lawyer, was his lawyer.
Quote, I'm his lawyer, was his lawyer. Well, that lawyer, Todd Blanche, is testifying today partly to try to prove the opposite, that he can now be an independent attorney general and no longer act like what he was, Trump's personal lawyer. So that shift into the present tense sounded like a classic Freudian slip today, where a verbal gaffe or a speech error can actually reveal the true unconscious view under the surface. We've all heard of this. It's the proverbial slip of the tongue that's pretty well known. And as people, we often get interested in these kind of psychologies. If we think someone has blurted their true underlying view from the subconscious out into the world, in this case, that would be, and I'm doing a little Freudian analysis, but you can decide what you think of Blanche, but that would be that if this were a Freudian slip, then Mr. Blanche improperly views his current job as doing whatever Trump wants, as being his lawyer. And I can tell you that even in the perhaps low standards of the Trump era, that is not something Blanche is supposed to admit under oath, fighting to get this job and still win over Senate votes. So with that in mind, and him not wanting to sound that way, here's just a little more of that moment as the nominee tried to clean it up.
Are you and President Trump friends?
I'm his lawyer, was his lawyer, and now I'm the Deputy Attorney General. So I met him as his criminal defense attorney. I'm not sure there's very many people who have ever had a criminal defense attorney who calls that person their friend. I now have a...
Well, let me put it this way. Are you enemies?
No, we're not enemies at all.
Now, as a side note, that was a Republican Senator Kennedy there. He was just trying to help Blanche with those kind of easy, vague questions when that slip came up, whether you think it's significant or not. And nobody thinks the two of them are enemies right now. He was just, of course, picked for this big post. Now, Senate politics are as unpredictable as life and death. The passing of Senator Graham has now left Blanche's confirmation hanging by potentially a single vote. And John Cornyn, who's retiring after Trump led that bid to oust him in a primary, is one of the senators who everyone is watching and who, knowing that, still chose to press Blanche on one of his most controversial stumbles, the now frozen effort to take your taxpayer money and give it to MAGA-allied convicts.
You have said that the weaponization fund is a moot issue. Is that your position?
Yes, it is a moot issue, meaning there is no weaponization fund. The weaponization fund is dead. It's not moving forward.
Is the settlement agreement enforceable as a contract by the parties?
Well, yes, it's an enforceable document. So I suppose if President Trump's counsel sought to enforce it, that they potentially could.
Including the weaponization fund?
Well, they could try to enforce the contract.
Blanche's answers there reinforce the Trump legal scam that kind of just blew up and failed. Because the they there are just the Trump representatives, other lawyers. But it's, of course, Trump's other representatives that run the DOJ. And that's why it was such a conflicted deal, which a judge has now halted. But to decode what's happening there, Blanche, on the one hand, is still trying to win over what could be skeptical senators by saying, well, the thing's moot, it's basically over. And yet, ever the Trump lawyer or former Trump lawyer, he was also trying to hold the door open a crack to other Trump lawyers restarting this crime fund at a future date by, as he put it, trying to enforce the contract. Now, it matters that Senator Cornyn was the one concerned about this because he's one of the only Republicans that could spike this nomination. You see how close it is. The New York Times story on today's hearing actually led with the exchange you just saw, noting that the, quote, fate of Blanche's nomination as AG remained uncertain after what the Times called a rocky hearing, noting Cornyn raised questions about Blanche's role in creating that fund, and that after the hearing, Cornyn said, I don't have to make a decision now, so I'm not. On the stakes, the article goes on to note what I just reminded you and why that senator matters, that, quote, even a single Republican no vote on the Judiciary Committee would block Mr. Blanche's nomination from consideration by the full Senate, and that could sink his entire confirmation. Now, that's how the Times put it. You take it all together here, and let's just level set. There are many, many issues under the DOJ in the Trump administration. Pam Bondi out pretty quickly. We had the Epstein issues, which also were covered today, and I'll get into with my guests. You have ICE. You have the killings of Americans. You have several losses in the Supreme Court. And yet think about what a bizarre, lawless zone we are in, that the big conflict here between Cornyn and Blanche, and what I just showed you, and the thing that the Times says might even be a part of dooming the nomination, is that even after a court has blocked this whole fund, Mr. Blanche, still fighting to get the job, so in the most reasonable mode he's ever going to be in, is leaving the door open with a court order against it to maybe try to get your taxpayer dollars still rerouted over to some convicts. And that would be funding convicts and perhaps the people who tried to overthrow our democracy. That would be the opposite of law enforcement. A reminder, the job here is to be the top law enforcement officer of the country. With that in mind, I want to bring in Andrew Weissmann, former FBI general counsel and Mueller prosecutor, and David Kelly, former SDNY chief. I should note, my former boss back when I practiced law. Both of you know a bit about law enforcement. Andrew, your view on that. We could hit so many issues, but even leaving the door open that way for something this brazen is really quite incriminating. And did you have a view on whether it was a Freudian slip or not?
Well, on the Freudian slip, under most circumstances, I would give somebody who's testifying for that long in this kind of hearing the benefit of the doubt and say it's just a slip. The problem here, and the reason I don't do that, is that we have all of his behavior as Deputy Attorney General and now Acting Attorney General, where he is acting as Donald Trump's counsel. So it's, to me, that is confirmatory of this Freudian slip approach. In terms of the fund and leaving the door open, I thought there was another exchange that directly left that door open, because he was asked about whether there were some other funds that the Department of Justice might use to give money to these January 6ers, such as the FTCA, which is a fund that exists. And he did not rule that out. He could have easily said, under my Department of Justice, no funds will be used to go to people on January 6th, or at least the January 6th people who were convicted of violence. But he did not do that. He said, well, they're free to make those claims, period, which to me was another tell in a moment when he should be trying to sort of close that door if he thought that was something that he could do.
David, your thought on the hearing today?
Look, I think there's two big issues here, right? There's Todd Blanche as a professional, as a person, his character, his integrity. And the second issue is the model that the president has created, his expectations for that office. On the latter, what he has created is, basically to have the Department of Justice as his law firm. That, I think history tells us, is a recipe for disaster. Look at what happened in the Nixon administration, and you have it to some degree, some significant degree, in Bush 43 with Alberto Gonzales. And in both instances, as we recall, Gonzales came out of being essentially the president's lawyer, as Todd was when he was White House counsel. Once you try to co-opt the Justice Department to be the lawyer's law firm, it doesn't do a service to the people of the United States, but most important, as history tells us, it doesn't do the service that the president hopes to get. So it's a big mistake on his part, and time will tell if that's true. With regard to Todd Blanche, look, I've known Todd many, many years. I worked with him. He was a consummate professional. He's very capable. He was a model prosecutor in the Southern District of New York. Does he still have those characteristics? That's a big question. A lot of people are asking that. If you buy into this model, which he does, then I think people say, yes, he has a character and integrity to carry out the duties of Attorney General under the model created by President Trump. But the big question is, and I think most lawyers, certainly most former prosecutors and prosecutors, would think that is not the model that they signed on to.
Yeah.
Well, Donald Trump has now paid E. Jean Carroll in full. He had to pay her $5.6 million of Donald Trump's money. The unanimous jury awarded that money to E. Jean Carroll in a lawsuit that took years for her to pursue. And it does not prove that the American justice system still works, even though Donald Trump is president. It just shows that the system worked in this case. And it does show that Donald Trump has not yet completely destroyed the American system of justice, although he is trying to destroy the Department of Justice. That is what Donald Trump wants his next Attorney General to continue to do, destroy the Department of Justice. The Democrats had a theory of the case in the confirmation hearing of Donald Trump's criminal defense lawyer, Todd Blanche, to become Donald Trump's Attorney General. Todd Blanche had already survived his first confirmation hearing last year to become the Assistant Attorney General to Pamela Bondi as Attorney General. He coveted that job of Attorney General every day of his service to Donald Trump. And when Donald Trump fired Attorney General Bondi and made Todd Blanche the acting Attorney General, Todd Blanche then launched an audition for Attorney General unlike anything we have ever seen in the history of American law enforcement, which included, among many offenses against justice, trying to indict a former director of the FBI for taking a photograph of seashells. Such was Todd Blanche's public, craven desperation to seize the title of Attorney General of the United States of America. Todd Blanche tried to indict James Comey for taking a photograph of seashells because Todd Blanche knows Donald Trump hates James Comey and wants him indicted. And that's the only thing Todd Blanche had to know. And so the Democratic theory of the case in Todd Blanche's confirmation hearing today was that Todd Blanche was not the people's lawyer in his role as Assistant Attorney General or as Acting Attorney General, and he would not be the people's lawyer if he is confirmed as Attorney General because, and this was the Democrats' theory of the case, he is Donald Trump's lawyer. And 1 hour into his testimony, Todd Blanche, the now provably, objectively stupidest person to ever sit for a confirmation hearing for the position of Attorney General of the United States, said, I'm his lawyer. Todd Blanche proved the Democrats' theory of the case against him with his own confession about who he really represents every day when he said, I'm his lawyer. It came after a typically childish softball question from Louisiana's Republican Senator John Kennedy, who has cast himself in the role of the Senate's country boy. He asks folksy questions that could not be easier for a nominee who he publicly supports, like Todd Blanche. But Todd Blanche got too comfortable with the country boy's questions, just too relaxed, so that by the time the senator asked Todd Blanche if he is a friend of Donald Trump's, Todd Blanche's way too relaxed answer was, I'm his lawyer.
Are you and President Trump friends?
I'm his lawyer, was his lawyer.
Nice try. Was his lawyer. He got it right the first time. I'm his lawyer. Case closed, as they say. But minds were closed on the Republican side of the committee, as usual, where only one Republican senator asked any challenging questions at all. Todd Blanche was born 1 year after the criminal Republican President Richard Nixon said, quote, mistakes were made in his ineffective and desperate defense of what was eventually exposed as the criminal conduct for which President Nixon was forced to resign the presidency. Mistakes were made was as far as Richard Nixon could bring himself to go in response to all of the crime that flourished around him that he encouraged and was part of the conspiracy. He could never say, Richard Nixon could not say, I made mistakes. He could only say mistakes were made. And so since that day, the year before Todd Blanche was born, one of the backstage flippant joke defenses that people throw around in Washington intending to get a laugh is, mistakes were made. But those are the exact words Todd Blanche chose in response to the 92-year-old chairman of the committee, Chuck Grassley, who, as usual, read every single question that he asked from a script prepared for him by his Senate staff, as he has done in every Senate hearing he has attended in his 45-year career. Chuck Grassley threw Todd Blanche a softball about his handling of the Epstein files, and Todd Blanche literally said, mistakes were made. That was his explanation for releasing private information about some of the Epstein survivors who suffered again at the hands of Todd Blanche and the mistakes that were made by Todd Blanche. Todd Blanche told the top Democrat on the committee, Dick Durbin, I'm not allowed to meet with them directly, talking about the Epstein survivors. And that was a lie, of course. Todd Blanche claiming that he's not allowed to meet with the Epstein survivors. And an hour or so later, in response to a Democratic line of questioning, he then completely flipped, forgot his previous answer, and admitted that, of course, he is allowed to meet with them. It's simply that he won't, no matter how many times they ask. Todd Blanche complained that Donald Trump was the first president to have any portion of his tax returns leaked publicly by a private contractor who was working with the IRS. And that is true. He's the first one to have his tax returns leaked because every other president of Todd Blanche's entire lifetime has publicly released every page of his tax returns. Every one of them have done that. Donald Trump is the only one who has hidden his tax returns from voters while in the presidency. On the Republican side of the committee, they encouraged Todd Blanche to spend much of his time talking about fraud and how successful he has been at the Justice Department pursuing fraud investigations, fraud on the federal government, including Medicaid fraud. But none of the fraud cases Todd Blanche referred to in his testimony come close to the greatest fraud ever perpetrated on the federal government, and that was the $10 billion fraud that Todd Blanche put his name to as the only person to sign a so-called settlement document in a case that began as Donald Trump's attempt to simply seize $10 billion from American taxpayers and put it in his own pocket and do it through phony litigation. Donald Trump mounted a frivolous lawsuit after the statute of limitations had passed, and he sued the Internal Revenue Service and the United States Treasury for $10 billion because that contractor at the IRS had leaked some portions of his tax returns. When that fraudulent attempt to seize $10 billion from the United States Treasury finally collapsed under political pressure, Todd Blanche and Donald Trump had to come up with something else. But the something else only happened, remember, because Todd Blanche, who refused to defend the federal government against Donald Trump's frivolous claim of $10 billion, could not pull off that $10 billion fraud gift to Donald Trump. And Todd Blanche sat there today as the only acting attorney general in history accused by a federal judge of trying to perpetrate a fraud on the court by participating in a fraudulent lawsuit in which Todd Blanche was, in effect, working for both sides of the lawsuit. That's what made it a fraudulent lawsuit. He was doing what Donald Trump wanted him to do, and he was not doing what any other attorney general in any previous administration would have done when facing a fraudulent lawsuit for $10 billion brought against the Treasury of the United States of America. The judge in that case has sent her findings to the New York State Bar, where Todd Blanche is licensed to practice law. She wants the New York State Bar to investigate Todd Blanche for what he did in that case. There are a lot of first-time in history stories in Donald Trump's regime, and Todd Blanche is at the center point of the $10 billion fraud story that he and Donald Trump tried to get away with and failed. But the attempt to help Donald Trump seize that $10 billion appears to have been enough to get Todd Blanche nominated as Donald Trump's next attorney general. Senator Sheldon Whitehouse said this.
Our research indicates that senior DOJ officials have never in the history of the department before faced a judicial inquiry into a fraud on the court participated in by the Department of Justice. That was the inquiry opened in Florida. The question about fraud on the court committed by the Department of Justice remains open in the judge's decision. Here's what she did find. She found that the Department of Justice colluded with the Trump plaintiffs, that the Department of Justice violated DOJ policies in that collusion, that department attorneys were derelict in their responsibilities as DOJ attorneys, that the department failed to zealously advocate on behalf of the United States of America, its true client. And as I said, the fraud on the court question remains open, an unprecedented allegation about the department.
Senator Cory Booker said something that summarizes Todd Blanche's life story as it will appear in future history books when Senator Booker said, "You've chosen Trump over truth."
You've spent today making a lot of promises to follow the law, promises to be independent, promises to serve the American people and not the president. But we don't need your promises. We have your record. We have watched you exercise one of the greatest powers entrusted to any public servant. And what have you shown us? 1,200 victims waiting for justice. What have you shown us? There's 2 prosecutions. While the people involved, the victims, are waiting for action, one of the people prosecuted gets the most cushy arrangement possible after you visit with her. Again and again, you seem to be favoring the interest of a president and the powerful. You've chosen Trump over truth. You've chosen corporations over the Constitution. And you failed to meet the test. I'll say this in closing. This is why your nomination should fail.
One of the survivors that you represent is Annie Farmer, and she reacted today to AG Todd Blanche's confirmation hearing, or Acting Attorney General Todd Blanche. This is what she had to say. Todd Blanche has failed survivors at every turn. He's overseeing an investigation that has repeatedly re-traumatized survivors and has sought to bury the case even as questions remain unanswered about Jeffrey Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell's vast network of enablers and supporters. Blanche cannot rewrite history or pretend this investigation is over when the evidence shows otherwise. The Senate must not reward this record of failure, deception, and disregard for survivors. We urge the Senate not to confirm him. Those last two lines, Todd Blanche does have a record of failure, deception, and disregard for the survivors. I was so glad to see this statement from Annie today, Jennifer.
Simone, you're absolutely right. It really was a very powerful statement, and thank you for having me. She's a very articulate survivor, and she speaks for many survivors when she talks about this really is not about politics, it's about crimes. It's really, and it's atrocious that Todd Blanche has failed to comply with the Epstein Files Transparency Act over and over again, whether it's on the redaction issue, over-redacting with respect to co-conspirators, and under-redacting for those survivors where victim information is revealed, or failing to provide a redaction list, which was a specific requirement of the law. Over and over, he just doesn't pay attention to what his obligations are.
Jennifer, the Vice President of the United States said that the controversy regarding the Epstein files and their release was a communications problem above all else. I want to play what he says and talk about it on the other side.
We absolutely screwed up the comms of the Epstein files, like we just did. But do I think the reason we screwed up the comms is because we were trying to hide something? No. I think Pam was trying to respond to the political moment. I think she overstated what we had and what we didn't have. And I think that she, got roasted for it publicly. If people want to say we mishandled the Epstein release, guilty. We did mishandle, especially the communications of it.
Jennifer, you've spent hours, days, weeks, months, years with some of these survivors. Was that a communications problem only, or did it go right to the heart of what these poor people have had to live with for so many years, being at the hands of this heinous, evil monster?
Luke, that's exactly right. To call this a communications problem is really absurd and demeaning to the survivors, whether it's Epstein survivors or any other survivor that needs to be listened to, and investigations need to be had. When you read those files, you look at them, millions of pages, where is the investigation of anyone? Nobody was investigated. You heard Les Wexner testify in front of the House Oversight Committee. Nobody ever contacted him. This is not an appropriate way to handle real crimes. And what would he have done if his daughter had been one of those survivors, or someone who had been involved in this, and her nude photographs had been released? Would Vice President Vance or Acting Attorney General Blanche be so cavalier and simply call it a communications problem?
No, and Todd Blanche is the one who actually ended up leading the communications response, which says everything from the Situation Room at the White House.
Insane. Yeah. Mr. Chairman, can I just say, I think it's also crazy that interview that Luke played with J.D. Vance, that it came out today. You made a point when it was playing that the right hand is clearly not speaking to the left hand. This is just amateur hour at the OK Corral.
Oh, it is. It is very much amateur hour, and unfortunately, Jennifer, that is the plight of the women who are held hostage by this administration. in getting the relief that they've been seeking for 30 years now. And I found it very interesting. I would love to get your thoughts on this point, that throughout the hearing today, did anyone mention Pam Bondi? I mean, the fact that Pam Bondi basically said 38 plus times in her hearing, in her testimony before the various committees, that it was Todd Blanche who orchestrated, organized, was the big bromo behind the scenes doing all of this. So if there was anyone who, according to the vice president, mishandled it, according to Pam Bondi, that would have been Todd Blanche. So here we are, all roads, all things circle back down that drain, right? Down that drain to Mr. Blanche. And so how do you see this? Am I not in the same spot here where I think everyone else should be? Because I really think at the end of the day, we can point fingers at Bondi, we can point fingers at miscommunication. You need to look at who was orchestrating and in charge and acting primarily as the consigliere, the one who was executing what Donald Trump wanted. And that was Blanche.
Michael, that's exactly right. And this particular consigliere was engaged in fake transparency from the beginning. He was meeting at the outset with the chief of staff and other members of the Trump administration in the Situation Room to try to protect the files from being released. And so what did he do? He came up with this kind of cagey, kind of fake transparency gambit where he said, okay, let's pretend like we really care about the Epstein files being released. And instead, we will just ask the courts to release secret grand jury testimony, knowing that that would never happen. And we saw the same kind of caginess and fake transparency today when he's talking about meeting with survivors, or really not meeting with survivors. When for the first time before he was saying, okay, no problem, open door, come visit, I'll meet with anyone. And today he said, well, I now have a staffer that might be able to book you to meet with that staffer.
Jennifer, it's actually ridiculous. Another thing that we found very ridiculous today is that Catherine Ruemmler was before the committee today, the Oversight Committee on the House side, and she was there. We don't have any video because, of course, when people go before the Oversight Committee, they don't want us to have any video. We will see a transcript very soon. And she was Goldman Sachs' chief legal officer, and she was Obama White House counsel. She is mentioned at least 8,000 times in the Epstein files. And this matters because when Epstein was arrested on July 6th, Ruemmler was one of 3 people he called. She helped craft media strategy, allegedly, for him. But this is what her opening statement said today. Epstein was a masterful liar, and he clearly lied to me. I can see now that he used me and other respectable people to legitimize his standing, and I know now that he often exaggerated his relationship with me to others. I could go on reading, Jennifer, but this feels like revisionist history to me.
I think that's correct, Simone. But what you see here from her, as we've seen from person after person that does these transcribed interviews, is their defense is hear no evil, see no evil. I saw nothing. There was nothing for me to see. He was a master manipulator. And for her to claim also that she was having a professional relationship with him is also absurd. Here she is giving him romantic details, intimate details about her romantic life. That's not what a professional relationship is part of. And I have to say, I'm particularly disappointed in Goldman Sachs for initially it seemed like she was going to be gone. There was going to be some consequence to her. But now, no, she's going to have a 2-year consultancy and pick her successor. That's not accountability.